All right, everybody, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into something that's way more common than you might think. We're talking sexually transmitted infections.
You might be thinking, whoa, hold up, this isn't really my scene, but hang on. The stuff you sent us, it talks about more than 30 different bacteria, viruses, even parasites, all being passed around through sexual contact.
Yeah.
And get this, almost half of all the new cases, they're happening in people between 15 and 24 years old.
It's a big chunk of the population.
It's huge. So it's pretty clear we got to talk about this.
We do. It's easy to think, oh, STIs, that's something that happens to other people.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is they're incredibly common. And the impact, it goes way beyond just the individual. This is a public health issue on a big scale.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. This age group we're talking about, 15 to 24, what makes them so vulnerable? Is it just like they're more sexually active, or is there more to it?
Well, yeah, there's definitely the fact that there's more sexual activity during those years, but honestly, it goes a lot deeper than that. We've got to think about things like access to health care, awareness of sexual health resources, and even just like feeling comfortable enough to talk about this stuff openly.
Right. It's not always easy to have those conversations, especially at that age.
Exactly.
Which is exactly why these deep dives are so important. Knowledge is power, right? And speaking of surprising info, I was blown away to learn that the most common non-viral STI is, get this, trichomoniasis?
Short chuckle.
Yeah. Doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it?
No.
But seriously, this thing is caused by a parasite. A parasite. And I bet a lot of people listening have never even heard of it.
Yeah, you're right. It's often overlooked. And part of the reason is that a lot of people who have trichomoniasis, they don't have any symptoms.
Oh, wow.
So they might not even know they have it, which means they could be passing it on to other people without realizing it.
Okay, now that's a little unsettling to think about. But all right, here's the good news. It is treatable. So, to everyone listening, if any of this is ringing a bell, don't freak out, but definitely talk to your doctor. What's important here is knowing the facts and taking action, right?
Exactly. Early treatment is key. And this is especially important for pregnant women, because if trichomoniasis is left untreated, it can lead to some complications.
Yeah, that's right. The research we have here, it says things like premature rupture of membranes, low birth weight. Those are serious risks. And it really makes you think about like prenatal care, right? It's not just about, treating the infection in that moment. It's about protecting the health of the mother and the baby.
Exactly. And it's a good point, because that brings us to another pair of STIs you've probably heard of, chlamydia and gonorrhea. Now, those names might ring a bell, but what's tricky is they can be sneaky.
Yeah, from what we've seen, a lot people with these infections, they don't even have any symptoms. So they might not even think they need treatment. But all that time, they could be passing it on without knowing it.
Precisely. That's why getting tested regularly is so important. Even if you feel totally fine, it's all about being proactive with your sexual health instead of waiting for symptoms to show up,
So what we're talking about here is potentially facing some serious long-term stuff like infertility without even knowing you ever had the infection in the first place. That's kind of a scary thought.
It is. And just like we talked about with trichomoniasis, both chlamydia and gonorrhea can cause serious problems during pregnancy. For example, the research mentions something called chorioamnionitis. It's basically an infection of the amniotic fluid and membranes that surround the baby.
Whoa, chorioamnionitis. I have to admit, I'd never even heard of that before we started this deep dive. So what are the risks there?
Well, it can lead to premature birth, low birth weight, and other complications for the baby. And it really highlights why we need to be talking about STIs openly and honestly, not just for our own health, but for the well-being of, future generations.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that something that might seem like, oh, this is my health, my personal business, it can actually have much wider ripple effects.
You got it. Now let's move on to a couple of STIs that people don't always like to talk about, herpes and syphilis.
Yeah, those are definitely some tough topics. There's a lot of misinformation and stigma out there. But hey, we're here to face this stuff head on, right? So let's dive into the research. First up, herpes. Now, this is a lifelong viral infection, which, let's be real, sounds kind of daunting.
I get it. It's understandable to feel that way. But the important thing to remember is that for a lot of people, herpes is manageable.
Okay.
You've got medication and stuff. It's not about being scared. It's about understanding how the virus works, taking steps to manage outbreaks, and, preventing passing it on to other people.
Right. That makes sense. And speaking of managing outbreaks, one thing that really stood out to me in all this research was the link between stress and herpes outbreaks. It's like our emotions, our mental state, it can actually affect our physical health.
Absolutely. A lot of times, herpes outbreaks are triggered by stress, both physical and emotional stress.
Right.
It really shows how connected our minds and bodies really are.
Wow. Okay, so syphilis. That's another one that seems kind of mysterious, maybe because it's often shown as something from like way back in the day. But based on what you share, it's clear that it's still a big deal today.
Yeah, you're right. Syphilis is still a major public health issue. And what makes it even more complicated is that it has multiple stages. It's a bacterial infection that progresses through different phases, and each one has its own set of symptoms, which makes it tricky.
So it's not just like you get it and then it's over. What do these stages actually look like?
Okay, so syphilis, it starts with this painless sore, and it's called a chancre, and it usually pops up wherever the infection got in, And if that goes unnoticed, or if it's not treated, it can actually move on to later stages, get rashes, fever, even hair loss. And what's really scary is if it goes untreated for years, it can actually damage your heart, your brain, all sorts of organs. It's serious stuff.
Wow, that's intense. Definitely not something you want to mess around with or, accidentally pass on to someone else. Speaking of passing it on, the research you shared also mentions something called congenital syphilis. That sounds pretty serious. What is that exactly?
Yeah, it's a really serious concern. Congenital syphilis is when the infection is passed from a pregnant woman to her baby, either during pregnancy or childbirth.
So the baby could actually be born with syphilis.
Yeah, it's a very serious situation. But the good news is it's preventable, especially with early prenatal care and testing. It's another example of how knowing what's going on and taking steps to prevent things can make a huge difference.
Totally. We've covered so much in this deep dive. We've talked about how surprisingly common STIs are. The stuff that can happen if you don't treat them, it's a lot. And it's clear that STIs aren't just a personal health thing. They can affect families, future generations. It's a much bigger conversation. But before we wrap up, I want to switch gears for a minute. Let's talk about what we can actually do with all this information. The research you shared was pretty clear. Prevention is key.
100%. When it comes to STIs, prevention is the most powerful tool we have.
So, practically speaking, what can our listeners do to protect themselves?
Well, first things first, using condoms. And not just sometimes, but correctly and consistently. Condoms create that barrier against a lot of STIs, and that significantly reduces the risk of transmission.
Makes sense. What about regular checkups and getting tested? How important is that?
That is absolutely crucial. Regular testing means you can catch things early, get treatment if you need it, and that helps minimize the risk of those long-term health problems we talked about. Plus, it helps stop the spread.
It sounds like knowing what's up and being open about it is really on the heart of all this.
You've got it. It's all about having those open and honest conversations with your partner, understanding what your risks are, and then making informed decisions about your sexual health.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive, I gotta say. We've learned about the science behind STIs, how important prevention and early treatment are, and even the social and emotional stuff that comes into play. But, it feels like we've just scratched the surface here. There's gotta be even more to explore, right?
Oh, absolutely. What we've talked about today, the biology of it all, the public health side, that's really just the beginning. It makes you think, right? Like, how do our attitudes, the things we learned growing up, even just having access to healthcare, how does all that affect not only how STIs spread, but also how we see sexual health in general? It's a big question.
It really is. And it's something to think about, right? So to everyone listening, we've spent this deep dive on the what of STIs, but the why, the social, cultural stuff, the reasons behind why they spread, and all the stigma, that's something to ponder on your own. Who knows, maybe it'll spark your next deep dive with us. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.